Okay, hello, dear ladies and gentlemen. We are here at our next Kyiv Media Hub event, and today we are speaking about French coverage of Ukraine. I will just quickly remind you that we are meeting here in Kyiv in the framework of the Europe-Ukraine Desk, which is a project launched by n-ost in spring last year. And we are aiming to connect French, German, Spanish, Italian, Hungarian, Bulgarian journalists with Ukrainian journalists and to help them to understand each other better for better coverage of Ukraine. And we are having this series of discussions. We had our conversations about German media coverage and Hungarian coverage of Ukraine. And also from time to time, we meet to just discuss the challenges of coverage of Ukraine for foreign media in general. And today we have this conversation about French media. And our speakers today are Tetiana Ogarkova, who is head of international outreach at Ukrainian Crisis Media Center and also a member of PEN Ukraine, volunteer, journalist, literary scholar, and many, many other things that she is doing. And we have Clara Marchaud, who is Ukrainian correspondent for Figaro, Mediapart, L'Express, and many, I guess, others media. And I think that both of them will introduce them a little bit more soon. So I will give the floor to our speakers, and we will have around 1 hour of their conversations. And then if you have any questions, you will have time to ask them.
Thank you very much, Oksana. So we are very glad to see you today. We'll be speaking in English with Clara for you to understand. But otherwise, if everybody can understand French, we can switch to French. Or we can switch to Ukrainian. But Clara will have some problems. So we'll talk about French coverage of Ukraine and of the war launched by Russia against Ukraine since 2014 at least. And we'll start with it will be a friendly exchange. We know each other with Clara starting from 2015, if I'm not mistaken, 16, if I'm not mistaken. So we met a couple of 100 meters from this place at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Clara was a young journalist at that time.
I was a student even.
Still a student then. So it's almost 10 years of friendship and professional contacts with Clara. And so it'll be a friendly exchange and you will be free to ask us any questions you'd like. We'll start with personal experiences to let you know who we are and what we do. And I'll ask Clara first about how come you're a French journalist, French student, why did you come to Ukraine, how it all started, your career, what Oksana didn't tell you, but Clara is also an author because she already published a book about Ukraine, about this full-scale invasion in French language. And it's a very interesting book, extremely interesting book. So, and she's making a lot of presentations of this book in France. She travels a lot in France. So, Clara, how it all started for you? Could you please describe your professional path?
Okay, I will. Thank you very much for coming here, and I'm also thinking about people who are watching us online. I'm gonna talk about it in a very short way, so that afterwards we can already talk more about what's interesting for us now, the vision of French public opinion, of French politicians, let's say, on Ukraine, and vice versa, how to cover the war. So I actually started, I have a bachelor degree which is focusing on Eastern Europe, and I actually started when I came to Ukraine. I was still a student, and I mean, like, my background is that I have this kind of academic background on the region, and I also saw how the vision of Ukraine changed in journalism and in the academic world. So when I actually went to Ukraine for the first time, most people ask me, why are you not going to Moscow? Why are you not, when I first saw, even I moved to Ukraine permanently in 2021 to work for French media, and it was like always seen, I think that Ukraine was always seen as like the second, like say, like a secondary country, a bit like the periphery. I also Before that, I never worked in Russia, actually. And it's kind of strange, like most journalists you'll meet, okay, people maybe not my generation.
You're simply too young.
Yeah, I'm too young, exactly. No, but really, like, I mean, that's something what I often say. Like, I was 18 when Maidan happened, so I didn't work as a journalist, and that's why I think that now we have a new generation of young reporters who have a completely different vision, simply because, like, and the same as Ukrainians actually, that simply because I wasn't born when the Soviet Union was here, like, you know, so it's just like, and to me, like, the Maidan and the war were always there since I started covering Ukraine. It was always there, and this I didn't know, unfortunately, Ukraine before the war in 2014, and I think that it changed a lot. I think that actually it would be interesting to have your point of view as well, Tetiana, because you worked a lot with French media in 2014, in 2022, and I think the French coverage, I saw it as a reader in 2014. There was in the French media, like, the vision of Ukraine was really this divide between there were two Ukraine, let's say, one Russian-speaking and one Ukrainian-speaking. And it was a bit like the reality is more complex, and actually academics, Ukrainian academics, foreign academics have worked a lot on this and have shown that there is there are many more divides, and in general there is many more ways to read the situation in Ukraine. But in 2014, I think that journalists who came, a lot of them came from Moscow, and they had this vision of the divide, and that kind of influenced how they covered the country, and they really showed this Russians, like, I think it's harder for us as French people to understand this question of language, because we are we have only one language in France, which is not the case in Ukraine. So maybe you can say a bit about the...
Yes, exactly. Let's come back to 2014. That's the exact moment when my career as a journalist started, because basically I'm very far from journalism. I'm a university teacher. I'm still working at Kyiv Media Academy, and at that time, back in 2013, when Maidan started, I was just a university researcher and teacher. And why it happened, this journalism in my life, just precisely because of Maidan, because there were a lot of media, foreign media at Maidan, and everybody who was speaking French or English or Spanish or Italian, everybody was a very high demand just to help this international journalists, because there were a lot of international press. They didn't know what to do. They never spoke the language, and they need some assistance. So we started like, I don't know, like fixers. And later on, I joined Ukraine Kyiv Media Center, which is still a couple of 100 meters from here. Maybe you remember this point for international press. There were daily press conferences. And I remember these French teams or French journalists with their cameras coming to Kyiv and asking very stupid questions like, please show us these radicals. Show us, please, these Nazis radicals on Maidan. We don't want to film them, but there is no Nazis, no radicals on the Maidan. We are trying to tell this story. We understood how many cliché, how many false ideas were present in the French media at that time. But at the same time, everybody was very much impressed. We Ukrainians, but also international press were very much impressed by the intensity of historical events on Maidan, on how people stayed, I guess some of you remember, stayed for 3 months on Maidan Square, peacefully, without breaking things, and how Yanukovych fled the country, and how I was present, by the way, the very day when there were shootings on Institutska Street, and by the way, accompanying French channel which no more exists. It was iTélé. No more existed, but you'll explain later to which group it belongs. And we were just filming these Berkuts from a distance, and it was a very intense, historically intense moment, and we understood quite shortly that Crimea is already invaded. And a lot of journalists followed to Donbass, because shortly enough, there were already combats in Donbass, and we still had to explain why people are speaking two languages. I remember these maps. You were talking about divided Ukraine, and I do remember these maps and these colors, the blue, east and south, and orange, center and west, and north. So it was very much divided, and there were a lot of speculations about two Ukraines, about this. And by the way, these maps, they corresponded to the maps which we were reading on the Russian side in these projects of New Russia, Novorossiya, if you remember, all these plans, because when combat started in Donbass, they still had plans for Kharkiv and for Odessa, but they failed. But these maps of divided Ukraine corresponded to the Russian plan. So no surprise that many international media were trying to interpret this orange Ukraine like radical Ukraine, like not real Ukraine, at least like a split country, un pays déchiré. And we were trying to explain that what you observe now, it's a kind of birth of a pretty new country, modern country. And I guess that this very intense period of 2013-14, it was a precious moment for a lot of media and for young people and for elder people, and a kind of number of journalists settled here in Ukraine, tried to settle here in Ukraine to cover the situation here. And it was during 2014 and 15, there was still a lot of job for them, but unfortunately what happened later, these, I would say, stagnation years, because the war continued, but the Crimea was lost, and nobody wanted to talk about Crimea, and it was a kind of a local war, and you can cover this once, you can cover this twice, but you're not going every month to, I don't know, Stanitsa Luhanska or Shastia, which belonged to Ukraine at that time, which we no longer control now, but at the same time there were extreme points of Ukrainian land. So some journalists French journalists were going there to cover what was happening there, but the major focus was on reforms. If you remember these reforms time when everybody was talking not only about Russia's war against Ukraine, but mostly about reforms Ukraine needed. And I remember all these people coming, trying to cover this issue, how Ukraine is changing with all positive sides and negative sides. So, but it is the intensity of coverage diminished during these times, and we had much less journalists during this time.
What's really interesting is that many French journalists actually wrote book recently about how they covered this period. I'm thinking about Paul Gogo and Elena Voloshin actually as well.
And Sébastien Gobert.
And Sébastien Gobert, of course, like who French journalist who works then, who wrote now books, and who kind of have this reflection and this step back. And recently I was reading this book by Elena Voloshin, who was actually in Crimea when it was annexed, and she was saying that then we knew that those like little green men were Russian soldiers. We just didn't have the proof. And I think that there is this problem, and it's still the case of like that the news needs to go really fast. You need to have information, and even now it's even worse, I think, than 10 years ago because of Twitter, of like social media, in France especially, we have this big tendency to have more and more chaîne d'info on continue, so like these channels which constantly show the news, kind of a bit of a CNN style. So in the last 10 years there are many channels that appeared in France which wanted kind of to copy CNN style of coverage, meaning like having only news constantly, and the problem is that that it makes everything goes faster, let's say, and that you don't really have this time for reflection. You don't really have this time to kind of learn more on a country. And I think that, I mean, the way I approach covering Ukraine, I mean, I have this like academic background on the region. I learned Russian in university, and then I decided to learn Ukrainian because I just decided to invest that time to kind of understand to understand like what's going on the ground, and like having this background in sociology, for example, and in political science. But it's not always possible now, and I think that it's kind of we can't really have expert journalists like all of these journalists who lived in Ukraine for several years. I mean, like there are some of them, right, like who've been working here for some time, but when the full-scale invasion happened, I think that there was a lack of expertise on Ukraine, that there was a lot of expertise coming from Moscow. I mean, even before the full-scale invasion, let's say that the years of stagnations were a bit over, because in 2021, from like April 2021, the first build-up at the border, and then during this whole year, there was like way more demand for news. But not necessarily more expertise, like because expertise takes time to build. I remember reading in French specialized media on like defense and military affairs, a story on the Ukrainian army, and just before the invasion, and like half of it was just wrong because it was from wrong sources, even though if you were looking in Ukrainian, there were a lot of sources. There were like parliamentary reports, there were like inside reports, there was some like public information. Just even the number of, for example, the number of how many, like the number of troops, the number of weapons, like specific weapons, things that could be checked, right? Like and I think that like a lot of the sources that they used there, for example, were just in Russian. And I think it was a bit of if they were not in English, and it was a bit of a problem. Like there was this thing that Ukraine was still seen as I think a bit of a secondary country, and not worth spending time, and not worth building expertise, and not worth your time.
Let's nevertheless add some names to this story. So when you're speaking about these years from 2014 until 21, you mentioned Paul Gogo. So who came to Ukraine approximately the same time as you, maybe a little bit early because he was here for Maidan, but he was still a student. So Paul Gogo, just to provide you in a very good example of how the journalist career was during these years. Paul stayed with us here in Kyiv for a couple of months, let's say 6 months, approximately like that. And then he traveled to Donetsk. Donetsk at the time was still possible to enter there, and specifically for international press. It was quite a short period when Ukrainian journalists and international media could enter Donetsk and Lugansk, like to cover what's going on. And Paul Gogo was 20-something years old at the time. He was what they call independent. He was pigiste. It's not independent. He was writing for a journal, but he was paid by articles. So how you say it in English? So this type
Freelancer.
of freelancer, yeah. And he was traveling in the Donetsk region and writing articles for different, mainly for West France and for some other newspapers. And when he came back, he was cancelled. He was prohibited on the territory of so-called DNR and LNR because of some scandal. And then he had no other choice but to go to Moscow. And it was in 2017 because his newspaper was saying, look, you can go to Moscow, there's still things to cover. You have nothing to cover in Ukraine. What Paul Gogo did, he published a book recently, approximately the same time as Clara Marchaud published his book about very precious pages about Donetsk back in 2014. What was exactly happening there? What was the mechanics of this coup d'etat, of this of these so-called separatists? In which way and how Russian forces were present on the ground. So he is a very precious testimony. And then he traveled to Moscow, and he was covering Moscow and Russia for a couple of years until the full-scale invasion started. And then he even covered some occupied territories, but from the Russian side, even going with the press tours, press tours to to Mariupol and to Zaporizhia nuclear station. So, and this is these are all the testimonies which are extremely precious for us, for history. But for sure, there are some professional risks here because as far as he traveled to Mariupol, and then even in the previous years, he traveled to Crimea, but from Russian territory, he has no right to enter Ukrainian territory now.
I think today you can't cover
Both sides.
Both sides.
Yes, just to tell
It's
you
just-
that
yeah.
some stories are continuing. And you mentioned we were talking about reforms and about corruption. There's another very important book written by Sébastien Gobert, our colleague, French journalist. The book about oligarchs, about Ukrainian oligarchs. This is not it's a very important book because it's many hundreds of pages. It's academic book which starts from 1991 and which ends with full-scale invasion, and which provides this very complicated process of who oligarchs are, how do they function, how the whole system functions, what was done to get rid of this influence, what is happening exactly during this full-scale invasion. So all this coverage which started, which was so-called stagnation years, I mean, we were calling stagnation years this years between 2015 and 21, but still there were a lot of work done by many people, many journalists like Voloshin, like Sébastien Gobert. Let's also mention Stéphane Siohan, who was also present on the ground all these years and who was covering from this media. So even during the stagnation years, there were French journalists present on the ground trying to give insights on what Ukraine really is.
I was going to ask you a question, but maybe we can move on to 2022 and maybe you can tell how was it for you, because Tetiana is actually kind of known as the voice of Ukraine in France because she helps journalists, she gives a lot of interviews. So what happened in 2022 when the full-scale invasion happened and there was a big lack actually of expertise, and when I was talking to colleagues, to academics, what they did is that they went right away to TV channels and started to just talk, because they were thinking like, even though I don't know what's going on, it's better that I talk because I know at least what happened before, let's say. So what happened for you? Your phone was ringing all the time, probably.
And by the way, I'll ask you the same question because I do know how your day of 24th February was, but I'll ask you the same question. So yes, this is so what we still do at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. We are just this media hub, and our task still is to inform international audience about what was going on and what is going on in Ukraine. We communicate in many languages, in French, in German, in English, and in Italian. But this, I will never forget this 24th of February, because the very moment we just had these first explosions. It was 4 or 5 in the morning, starting from 6 in the morning. There were a crowd of French media calling and asking for a commentary. So instead of thinking about what do I put in my bags, if we are going anywhere or we are not going anywhere, so what we do, I gave, if I'm not mistaken, 11 interviews during this 24th of February. And when we left to our dacha here close to Kyiv, I understood that I forgot my passport at home because I was too busy talking to French media. And why it was important, it was a kind of mission just to explain what is really going on, what this war is about, so that what Russians really do, because if all of you remember that during these days there was a lot of propaganda saying that Russians are targeting military targets in Ukraine, and it was a very dramatic and intense period, and so did all of our colleagues, I imagine, in many languages. They did the exactly same thing in France as well. Our academics, from academic staff, teachers, professors, they were talking to the media all the time, trying to explain what is really happening. And it was important to, and you remember also that we are not speaking about Kyiv, but some media started to leave Kyiv, not speaking about Kharkiv and other places. And you, Clara, I know that you've been exactly in Kharkiv, so 30 kilometers from Russian troops the moment this full-scale invasion started. So would you please describe your day of the...
I'm not sure it's the most interesting thing to talk
Yeah,
about.
but it is,
the
but
worst day of my life, right?
I know, I know.
For many people. Yeah.
I know this story because it's very well written and described in Clara's book.
Yeah, maybe
about
I'll
Ukraine.
talk a little bit. Like I'll go, I think, to the book and why I decided to write a book. But I was like working actually with like the day before that I was working with a colleague in Mariupol, and then we decided to. We saw that something bad was gonna happen, and we decided to leave, and we went to Kharkiv, and then I kept working for Le Figaro, my main media, and I started working as well for AFP, like the Agence France Presse, which is an agency, so it's a little bit different job, and I used to work for them in France. So at that point, I went from Kharkiv to Kyiv, and at that point, it's just, just like doing the job was, I don't know, we're just trying to do something, to like publish something. Anything was kind of newsworthy, like any information that we could bring from the ground was newsworthy. And going back to the coverage from French media, I would say that I think it's interesting to go back to that time, and let's say that even my colleagues in France told me later, and my editors told me that they have never seen a war that have been so covered. So there was so much coverage. There was like so much coverage, and to tell you, there were so many journalists that came. And I think it helped Ukraine a lot, and to some extent, sometimes it didn't help Ukraine, but for other reasons. But I remember at the very beginning working in Lviv and seeing like people I studied with and I haven't seen for 5 years from my university just in Lviv, where I usually go and like where I was celebrating Christmas 2 months before, and I would see like just like colleagues or random people that I know from Paris, right? So there was really this feeling that that there was really like just a lot of coverage. Sometimes I think that at that time there was also coverage that was like just let's say that French media, and media in the world, I think sent a lot of people. There were also a lot of freelancers that came, not necessarily well equipped to cover the intensity of the war.
And not necessarily in Kharkiv and in Mariupol. So people, international media were also fleeing these combat zones.
So there was kind of a... Like, it's hard to say today to, point fingers because we just did the best as we could, right? But there was a lot of coverage, for example, from Lviv, from the border. There was very little coverage from Donbass and from Kharkiv, like zones that were accessible, but also because it was really complicated, it was really dangerous. I'm just saying, like, in the way that it was wrongly covered, because at that point, I met a lot of people actually that were working, for example, in the north of Kyiv, that I met actually people who were kind of re-traumatized by journalists, not necessarily French ones, but for example, I met some people in Borodianka who told me that like foreign journalists would ask them would film them and film, for example, things that they didn't want to show, would like really push them. I remember as well, like at the beginning when we worked in April, when Bucha, when Bucha was liberated, there was really a bit of a morbid race to find the people who were raped. And it was really like, when you have so many journalists looking, like, it's in a way, it's kind of not okay. And I remember this press tour by the Ukrainian army was like, on the one hand, yes, they needed to be coverage. On the other hand, there were like these buses of journalists being brought to Bucha. And up to today, like, it's something that I still question. Like, maybe on the one hand, more people were shocked in the world, let's say, because of all of this coverage. On the other hand, it means that there are some other things that are way less covered, and because they're less new. I mean, I'm thinking, like, often I go back to places that were covered, like, I usually don't go the first week when a territory is liberated. I would go like maybe a few days later and then come back. And I regularly worked in Borodianka, and a lot of people, when I went there, after like maybe even 3 months, they would say like, there was at the beginning, there were just so many journalists, there was so much coverage, and now everybody forgot about us. And the more you go to the east, by the way, and the more people were forgotten. And now today, like I see, for example, that there is such such little coverage on occupied territories. That's like, I mean, the goal of my next project, like what is happening in Mariupol, right? And it's so hard even today to sell these stories, really, like because it's not accessible, because like sometimes editors would tell me, oh, but we had someone who went on a press tour, so it's enough for coverage, right? Which is a bit like, I mean, it's just wrong to me. But I mean, like, it's just, there was this whole like massive coverage like the first year. And then it seems that that there is like way less, and that like, that there kind of was a lack of strategy on how you cover as well after the first year. I mean, even
and during this first year there are a lot of different specific periods, because the first weeks they are very specific, when the danger was real. It was real for everybody. It was real here in Kyiv. I remember, for example, this what you call this. The search for sensational news. I remember, for example, journalists asking me, like, how do you feel being encircled by Russian tanks from seaside? So it's a city, will it fall tomorrow or day after tomorrow? So, you know, all these kind of questions. So for somebody who is inside the city, so it was like
sensitive questions.
Like, yes, emotional. So the aim was to get you emotional. I don't know, to cry, to be emotional, and not to inform about what. And by the way, it was false. Sometimes it was false about that the city was surrounded from Cyprus, and so it was like that. And what you are telling about Bucha, I do remember our discussion with Stefan Sioan, who also covered Bucha, but he covered it later, after all these difficult first days. He went there in May maybe, and he provided such a portrait of Bucha, not like a devastated place, but also a place he knew before the war, where his friends lived, where he went many times. So this kind of, for French people to be able to imagine such a thing about their neighborhood or about their place, just there's something about this coverage of ruins which is very vicious. I mean, when you cover places like Izum, we've been to Izum, for example, with this crowd of journalists trying to film these dead bodies in this Izum forest. So, but it's maybe better for this understanding to explain that this is not only Izum is not only about these bodies, it's also a place, it's a home for somebody. It's a place where people lived peacefully for generations. And just to make people not only observe these ruins, but to imagine themselves in place of people who suffered all these destructions and all these bombs and shellings. This is important to make this story closer to the audience. And many journalists, I think that what you do, Clara, is very good in your book and in your coverage, and other people. I mean, French journalists like Stéphane Sion, they did the same effort to make the war understandable for others. And by showing only ruins, remember how we observed, I was working at Hromadski International during the war in Syria. And I remember we were presenting the news about what was happening there. When you look at these ruins, you talk about that, but you don't really feel what does it mean for people who live there to lose their city, to lose their village. So this is a good way to explain and to make it understandable for the audience.
And I think at the beginning as well, there was a really strong identification for French people, for example. There was a really strong identification to like to Ukrainians, like French people had this feeling that it could happen to them. There was this kind of feeling that it is a common war. I remember on TV they said this, which was like this expression was a bit criticized later, where actually some commentators were saying, "Look, they have the same cars as us." Which is also questions your it questions the empathy. It means that you have more empathy, and this is true that there is more I think that there is more empathy towards Ukrainians than there was towards Syrians, because it's closer, because Ukrainians are white, because Ukrainians have the same way of living, like kind of quite similar. And I mean, I remember like in France when I did those presentation, I also saw that a lot of people came like when I presented the book, which is about daily life during the war, and people felt really like connected, let's say, like they really had a strong identification. And at the very beginning as well, I remember like some of one of my professors from university went to talk about Ukraine he was invited in some kind of small town. Like it was a village that was 6,000 people, and like almost a quarter of the town, like 1,500 people came to this presentation, and it was in March 2022. So you can see that like there was, just to explain you to what extent there was like interest, to what extent people wanted to understand, because there was a very strong identification. Also because I think that people in France, but also in Germany, in the UK, I mean, they kind of read this war through the frame of and the framework of the Second World War. So in France, what would be very moving and where we could connect are the stories of resistance, for example, because we had resistance, and this is kind of in our national myth and national story, the way that we resisted to German soldiers. Although we also had we had the problem of collaboration, and this is actually quite interesting to compare this time. For example, in the UK, and I'm pretty sure that a lot of readers, and why is the UK supporting Ukraine so much? Because they had the Blitz, because they had like so much bombings, they had experience of bombings, and I think that this is like every country kind of connects or not with Ukraine, and everyone reads it through their own experience. And sometimes, even when I present the book, a lot of people come to me and say, "Oh, it's like what my grandma told me about the war," about like, so they really read it, and you saw it, I think.
And yeah, but you're talking about the Second World War.
Yes.
But what I mentioned in many occasions, in many different contexts, that French people, they compare what's going
the
on
First
now
World War.
with what they call la Grande Guerre, big war, Grand War, the First World War.
The Great War, yeah.
Yeah, Great War. And it was in a very unhappy context, by the way, for the first time. You remember maybe it was in summer 2022 when Emmanuel Macron was talking about we should not humiliate Russia. And then he had to explain the context of why he was saying, and when he was here in Kyiv together with Chancellor Scholz, and together with Draghi, and together with the Romanian leader, he had to reconstruct all the context of this phrase, because he was talking he was comparing what was going on here in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, with what was happening between Germany and France back in the First World War. And he was talking about this very humiliating humiliating defeat for Germany, which gave grounds to what we call the Second World War, because this feeling of revenge, it was still present among German population for all these 3 decades between the end of the First World War and the Second World War. And when Emmanuel Macron was talking about you should not humiliate Russia, it was in the context that you should not humiliate Russia after the defeat, like French did. If you remember the condition of this Versailles treaty, so the conditions of the post-war for Germany were extremely humiliating. So, and they were nourishing these revenge feelings among German population, which led, besides to this second aggression. And when talking to different conferences, I personally met a couple of historians, historians of the French Big War, and they were comparing for many things. They were comparing, for example, this war of trenches. When back in November 2022, the front lines were not so much moving after liberation of Kharkiv region and the liberation of Kherson and region. So if you remember, so it was like a trench war, so the front lines were not moving a lot. And a lot of French historians and in public opinion, this war was something like the First World War. And even I was told by some French volunteers that when they were organizing, I don't know, collects of humanitarian aid in France for Ukraine, strangely enough, not strangely enough, in the eastern part of France, which suffered much more from this First World War than other parts of France, because the front line was in that part, there were much more solidarity with Ukraine. They were sending more things, they were contributing more money. It was more easy to organize campaigns, to collect for, I don't remember, for generators at the time, for vehicles, for anything. So, because people, they have this story, this family story in their family, and they remember and they still compare this Ukrainian war, this Russian war against Ukraine with the First World War as well.
Yeah, and I mean that this is what I see when I presented in different places in France. The historic comparison kind of depends on the people's family history, and some people came to me saying that they felt like quite connected with Ukraine just because like they had the history connected to the war. But I think that I think we could go on the topic as well of Russia.
Your book. No, let's talk first about your book. So, Clara, she's the author of a book she decided to write at a very specific moment in this war. It was after first couple of months, right? So, would you please tell us the story? What is this book about, and how do you think it helps Ukrainian French audience to better understand what the real war is?
So actually I worked in 2022. I wrote a lot of stories, and it was really hard news. So it was really like, you know, kind of what's going on. I'm writing the story, and this is like, you know, kind of the stories that you write fastly. And I mean, like, I think like a lot of journalists, I was working all the time, and you kind of didn't have this time for reflection, to think about what was going on. And also after some time, I wrote this book actually in 2023, in the second half of 2023, because I felt like the stories were not enough anymore, and also the focus of French media was changing. So after this big interest where really you could do, I remember like every time there would be a strike in Kyiv, we would write a story about it. And then there came this time where we would like run to another city because there was a strike. We would run to Kharkiv because there was a strike, and there were like sometimes we would go like just, you know, to show this. And then after some time, like the bombings kind of became routine. Which is quite a horrible thing, like that. Unfortunately, in the coverage of the war, people need something new, and like I think that the audience and the media industry covered this war a bit and sees this war as well as a way, you know, as a Netflix movie kind of. And we had a great character because like Zelensky was a great character, and you know, like, so we had like you know, the liberation of territory, and every time people, like, it was so funny because French people would know where Bakhmut is, and like there was this joke like that a Ukrainian come and says that, oh, I'm from the east, and they're like, oh, are you near Bakhmut or near Slavyansk, right? Like, so French people would really like know the geography of Ukraine, start to know where Sumy is, for example. And so after that, like it came, you know, there was a bit of fatigue. Also because there were no quick, I mean, like the 2022 was like quite amazing how Ukrainian forces liberated so like territory so fast when you think about it. And so let's say that our public opinion kind of got used to it and they wanted new positive outcome. And when the positive outcome went there, they were looking for flaws. So then there started to be more interest to political stories, to corruption stories, mobilization problems, problems in the army. And I think it's true, and I think it's something that we should cover. Although I felt like at one point it was a bit like there was so much a will to find something new. I just remember that I had to write so many stories about people who want to escape mobilization, and like at a point where it wasn't such a big story. Like, and in the end, I ended up like writing maybe 5 stories on this in 2022, 2023.
This is precisely just a small detail. This is precisely because nothing was happening. So I mean, because
nothing was happening on the battlefield.
I mean, on the battlefield. So it was a lot of events for us Ukrainians because people were still killed and wounded, and there were a lot of battles, and there were still shellings, intense shellings. But I also remember that previously, French media would contact me immediately after, I don't know, Kharkiv was bombed or Zaporizhzhia was shelled, just to get just a reaction. And then it became, if it happens on a daily basis, it's no more news. So it happens every day, so it's a kind of normal that Ukraine is shelled. And that's precise, and given that front lines are not moving, so tell us a story. Tell us a story of these people who escape mobilization. Tell us any kind of sensational story.
But I mean, like, this is what was hard for me as a journalist, but also because I live here and because I have like close one here. Like I call close ones. Is that like to me, you know, like when I sometimes say this story, like that some of my friends' apartment was the apartment that was bombed next to the railway station. It was a neighbor of my friend. Like, so the woman from Good Wine who died, the pregnant woman who died then, and like this building. So, you know, like to me, every building is still like, you know, and it's still like it's still a story, and so that's why I felt like, and I understand as well that like you can't cover all the time the same things, that like that you can't like, and there are other things happening in the world that you need to kind of like think about how to cover it. So I think that the way for me was to write, like the way to change it was to write this book, to give, you know, like, because that some small details were not newsworthy, but I think they were worth knowing for the audience. And that's why I wrote this book. That's why I wrote, like, I did interviews with, like, with Ukrainians, and I kind of, like, the interviews about some really intimate story. Like, the book actually is about, like, it's called An Intimate History of the War in Ukraine. Such a long February.
And here you have chapters like, for example, take a shower. Taking a shower.
Hygiene during war.
Or, for example, close the door. How we close the door? So, like,
close the door is about, like, is the chapter about home. How your relationship to your home changes during the war. How a place that can be very familiar to you can also become dangerous, and like can't, like, how does it happen when your home is like under occupation, when you have to leave it? Where I kind of did like different interviews, and I think that was my answer to this, because this coverage, like, because I still wanted people to when they close the book to think like, oh wait, if it would happen to me, what would I do? And I think that this is we still need to do like human stories. We still need to do report, and but it's kind of, yeah, it's a challenge a bit. And I think that also there is a big actually, that I really thought about this, and I think this is something really worth knowing for Ukrainians, that unfortunately what drives the coverage in Ukraine right now, I think, is mostly money. that French media just don't have the resources to do it. The French media landscape, and I go a bit further, the French media landscape is quite specific. We have oligarchs owning our media, and in the last 2 years it really changed. And in the last 2 years we had bought outs, we had we have less public subsidies towards the media, and so even teams right now, I know right now that a lot of media are pulling out their team. Actually, the French TV channel will stop sending constantly people to Ukraine because just they don't have the resources to do it. And there was a shift as well, I think, in the coverage of Ukraine after the 7th of October last year and the war in Israel and Gaza, because for two reasons. Because first, of course, that there is just a simple question of time and resources, how many journalists you have, and a lot of journalists who were here just went to Israel, and then now they went to Lebanon. So just in terms of money, resources, you don't have that much. And we still have a kind of a vivid landscape, but we are not the Americans. We often say we are not the Americans or the British. We just don't have that much money in the media, or the Germans, or the Nordic countries. But we still have a lot of journalists. And the second thing is that I think, which is quite important, is that in France, Russia actually did a big campaign of false flag operations to create divide around this conflict, because I think that it's quite. It's useful for Russia to have France really busy with this conflict. And in France, we saw several false flag false flag operations where they they did a lot with even with related to Ukraine, but they did even more related to the war in Israel. But for example, they brought this was last year. They brought coffins under the Eiffel Tower with written that there were soldiers, French soldiers. Recently, also, I was in France and I saw that they made a small protest, which I was really shocked. They did a small protest for the children of Donbass that were killed by the Ukrainian army, so under the Eiffel Tower. And when you looked at it, when I looked at the video afterwards, they just there were literally posters in Paris for this protest. And then when I saw the video, it seems like these people were just that these people were paid, kind of, or there were this kind of pro-Russian movement that we had for a long time.
One thing, Clara, before you continue, so it's another way to organize information about a country in war when nothing happens. Nothing happens, it's like today, so everything happens every day, but nothing specific. It's about anniversaries.
Yeah.
Don't you remember? So for 24th of February last year, and I'm pretty sure for 24th of February of the next year, there will be a lot of journalists here in place, covering and just now we are talking about 1,000 days of full-scale invasion coming. And I remember that some journal asked for an article from our side. We sent the article. It was back in July 2024. And then I asked the editor, what's going on? So have you already published this article or not? Because I haven't seen it online. Say, guys, we are waiting for the date 1000 to publish it because it will be symbolic. So if you compare that with, 11 interviews during the first hours of full-scale invasion, so they're waiting for this symbolic day or 1000 day of Ukrainian resistance now. And so, and teams, they're short on budget, and they're accumulating money for teams to come here on the 24th of February or 2025 and to be there and to tell the story about yesterday, a day before yesterday. I had a call from a Canadian very famous journalist, radio journalist, and also diplomat. He contacted me and he said, look, I'd like to come to Ukraine, but I'm waiting for a good moment. I think that Christmas Eve would be a good moment to come to Ukraine. I'll tell a human story about how Ukrainians are celebrating Christmas, by the way, for second year in a row with the Western world. So I'll tell this story. I'll still wait for 2 months to come here to cover that. So people are trying, they're short in resources. They're trying to find a way and a place to tell the story, because today you have this disaster in Spain, in Valencia, and then you had things in Gaza, and then you still have other killings elsewhere in the world. So they're trying to find a good moment to talk about Ukraine.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to like. I think that also, like, I mean, the coverage of Ukraine really depends on what's happening elsewhere in the world, and there was a bit as well, a bit of people were tired, and sometimes even some editors told me like, oh, when I was publishing some stories about war crimes, like, oh, but people are tired, they kind of don't really want to read it, like some stories, and the more you go, and like basically the less. First, like, just let's say that the threshold of what is horrible needs to be higher, which is horrible. Like, it means that something like, let's say that something more horrible needs to happen for people to care. And I mean, and we see it as well, like with what's happening in Gaza, and so many people are killed there. Like just unfortunately, there was a big, like, let's say that there was a big debate that started, and especially after this war, there a lot of things. I think it's something that you don't really feel here, but there was a lot of questions from the audience. Why did we talk so much about Ukraine, and why don't we talk more about other parts of the world, including the Middle East? Which I think is a problem not of Ukrainians. It is always what I say. It's not a problem of Ukrainians. It's a problem of French racism. You know, like, it's not like the problem of Ukrainian that we cared more about certain death, let's say, but I think that it's really challenging, and it's really harder to talk today about war crimes because like sometimes you have this feeling that people don't want to hear about it. And I remember when I was presenting, like when I do a presentation of my book about the war, like people come and, you know, to listen. But once I did like a book fair, so I had the book that was like just there, and it was already, I think it was this year. Yeah, it was this year. So already like some time afterwards, and everybody like you know, regular French, and there were books about everything. You could just like find anything, right? And people were coming and they were looking at my book and they were like, oh, and they were going away. Like, and some people were like, look at me, and they'll be like, oh, that sounds horrible. I don't want to read that. Like, and they would because yes, of course, it's like it's a defense mechanism, and we need to. And I think that like as journalists, we have this challenge that we need to overcome this defense mechanism. We need to like show people what's happening.
But exactly, your book is about, no, it's not about horrors of the war. It's about everyday living during the war, how to live a life when there is a war outside.
I mean, I have a chapter about love, and which is super
about
popular.
Friendship,
about love,
about what we eat, about
friendship, about like you know, like it's sometimes it's like really some really things that everybody has, kind of.
Clara, let's talk for the last topic we'll develop here before some questions we hope will come, would be not about media. So we talked about media. So you talked about shortages in budgets, about how people are tired and how these strategies are changing. But what is important is about how public opinion reacts to what's going on in Ukraine. Because you remember during 2022, there were a lot of people coming abroad, and some of these people came to France. And I was told many times, by the way, that these Ukrainians in France, they are the best ambassadors of the country. By the way, you'll be surprised, but I was told officially by very important people who said that, you know, all these women coming to France, which are so active, and they're opening, I don't know what kind of beauty salons. They are real ambassadors of Ukraine, because what French people see, they see educated women, mostly women, with kids, and they're white women, and they are polite, and they are workaholic, and they're good, and so it was a good factor. So they were,
and they got help as well. Like, I mean, and they got way more help than any other refugees.
I mean, I'm talking about the reaction of a white French, not about other French who are against it. And but now, what can be just an example from my experience, and I'll let you talk about how do you evaluate this public opinion. Recently, in July 2024, I've been to France to a very important conference, Tocqueville Conversations, and I was talking about Ukraine and about many things, and I got people coming up to me and saying, "Oh, but I didn't know that the war was so close to us. So it's just 3 hours of flight. So it's so close to us. I was thinking that Ukraine is much far away from us." So it was there were people informed. So there were educated people, highly educated people, experts, maybe in different fields. But for them, it was still very far away. Very remote countries of which we know little. You remember this quotation. So for them it was a surprise to get to know that Ukraine is close to European borders. So what do a French population thinks about, or maybe it doesn't think about Ukraine at all?
Actually, I checked recently, like just before coming, I checked the latest polls in France, and what's interesting is that in 2022, before 2022, there was just like very little knowledge on what is Ukraine, where is Ukraine, like, oh, Ukraine is not a part of Russia, oh, isn't it USSR there? Like, so really, like, the knowledge on this region of the world in France is very low, and it was very low, and then suddenly, basically, I think that a lot of people just discovered what Ukraine is. So, like, you see in 2022, the overall vision was like 80% positive vision from French people, 80% positive of Ukraine. And the poll was done this summer, and it was 58. And the poll now, let's say that when you ask French people the question, like, do you think that France should, that European allies should give more weapons to Ukraine? It's about 50-50 on should they give more or should they give less, like, or should they stop giving. Before it wasn't the case. The support was like way more important. And I think here when you look at like French at the results, like where there is a divide, you really see that there is a divide by political color. And let's say that now the French population is extremely divided between on the political spectrum. Let's say between the left wing, the far left, let's say, which is like more like Mélenchon and former communists, which in general do not have a very positive vision of Ukraine because they kind of have because they have this let's say traditional vision, which is a bit more from Moscow, and then and then you have like the traditional right-wing kind of voters. They have historic connection with Russia, a lot of business connections with Russia, and then you have far right, which are kind of more and more important in France. And literally, like Marine Le Pen was financed by Russian banks, and and you see that these three kind of groups in the public opinion, they really do not, they tend to not support Ukraine and to support it less and less. And in the last year as well, there was like even more divide because in the far left, for example, a lot of people tend to support Ukraine even less because they have this argument that, why is our government, like, like Macron and like the center, let's say, left, center, right, let's say,
So
this
ruling parties.
Yeah, ruling parties, and in general, this kind of like center of the opinion. Why do we support Ukraine and not like, Palestine? And then on the far right, there was more and more discussion that like this was quite expensive, and Marine Le Pen is also using this kind of argument that this war is expensive, and this is it's money that could go to like French people, and it's going to weapons and to the war. And there is like a bit this pacifist movement, like let's say in France, and I think you saw it. So let's say that now, because this opinion is like the public opinion is even more divided, and on both sides of the political spectrum, actually, what's quite interesting is that Russia financed, and there were a lot of research on this, that Russia financed all of this. online operations to change the opinion, change the public opinion. So there were like even I also like did some research before coming here. Like there were some stories online, propositions that like ads that were targeting like French people, that said that Ukraine, that French soldiers are going to die in Ukraine, that French soldiers are already in Ukraine. There were some false ads where you could like call and sign up to get 5,000 euros to fight in Ukraine, and then all of this was linked to Russia, right? Like, and what's even more dangerous, I think that what's even more what's really serious for the state of our media and the state of our democracy is that we even had cases where journalists, we have like cases in BFM Télé, a journalist that was paid, that got money to spread fake news, to spread like stories that were pushed by foreign governments, including Russia and Qatar. So like what that guy did, that was that for 6,000, 8,000 euros, he would like go on TV. And he was a famous TV presenter, and he would, and he didn't know, I think Russia was behind. It was an Israeli company that was behind. And he would say, oh, the sanctions are really bad for the economy in the south east of France, on the Côte d'Azur, in Nice and everything, because all of those people who work in on the yachts, who work in this property, now they don't have work anymore, which actually like is false. It's just false. It's like these people didn't, the sanctions didn't have any impact on the local economy there. But this was on national news and nobody checked it. And he could like just say it like this. And because there is this kind of fast news, because you need to go to like fill in the void, to talk all the time, you have a lot of like, you know, kind of agents of influence, or like just random people who have like an agenda, who come and talk online, like on TV, and sometimes say false stuff. And I think that this is pretty dangerous for our democracy, let's say.
Yes, exactly. So we lasted for 1 hour and 10 minutes, and not to end on this pessimistic landscape, but I'll just add some stories and we'll ask you for questions. So about French attitude, we do have French soldiers on Ukrainian front line. We do know personally one guy who is actually on the front line. His name is Jonathan Delporte. We met close to Kherson in Chernobyevka, so he's here starting from March 2022. He was wounded twice and he is still on the front lines. We do know a French journalist, Sébastien Gobert, who made all the way from Lviv to Brussels on his bicycle to raise money for a car for this very French soldier. And we do have a very
I don't know him, but
Ah?
I don't know the Jonathan.
Jonathan, if you we are seeing him day after tomorrow, so we're traveling to see him day after tomorrow. So we're starting to travel tomorrow, and we do have a French media, West France, who provided a lot of money for us to buy a vehicle for Ukrainian army, for Ukrainian medical service. And we are bringing this car to the front line just this weekend. So there's still a lot of solidarity in France to what is happening here in Ukraine, even if I would agree with what Clara says. Unfortunately, it happened. It's not the first time it's happening. It's also happened back in 2015 and 16, less attention, the same shellings, no interest. It's not about me. So people are not interested in what it's not about their lives, and this gives a ground for populisms, for all kind of Russian influence. So I would not say this is good, but this is in a way normal. I mean, it happens, and we Ukrainians, we are to work with this reality and to do whatever we can to make French people be together with us, because it's clear enough that without partners, without allies, Ukraine is incapable to win this war. So thank you very much for listening to us for 1 hour and 10 minutes, and now you even more, 12 minutes, and now we have time for a couple of questions.
I will give you.
Good evening, Valeria Pashko. I represent the public broadcaster of Ukraine, and I have a couple of questions for you. So, the first one, you mentioned that there was a lack of expertise in Ukrainian affairs when the full-scale war broke out, and I know that even Western scientists study Russian science, and these people study Ukraine as well, or they can, comment on something related to Ukraine on TV, at least. So, what's your perception? Has the situation changed over the past 2.5 years? And probably the last one, the last question, you know. So France and Germany used to be like common power within the EU and NATO, like for decades. And
Maybe I should answer the first question because I think I will forget the first one after, and then you can ask the second one. No, but like about the why. I mean, like the reason why the expertise was on Russia was also, like it's. I mean, I always a bit come back to money. You think that I have a, I'm focusing on this, but like because also like it was a question of business. It was a question, for example, like I mean, it was in academics, for example, it was like easier to get grants. So just like academics were focusing more on, we're learning Russian, we're like focusing more on this region. In business, it was the same. In media, it was the same. I think after 2022, everything changed because I mean, like in a way, we are at war as well with Russia in the sense that we, we are allies with Ukraine, we provide weapons, and like now it's much harder. Like I mean, it was already the case, but for journalists to get visa there, for academics to get visa there, some even like a French researcher was arrested there. So like in general, there was a switch, and a lot of people, and even when I talk to academics in France, like a lot of them were a bit lost, like the ones who are really working on Russia because they just have no way to go, like to to cover there and to like do their research. Like let's say that. The good thing is that the experts, the Western experts, or like the French experts, let's say on Ukraine, had more space to talk. I mean, like in academics, for example, like the experts that were invited on TV, they had just more space to talk. So this expertise that already was created could like come to the general public. And also now there is way more. I gave lecture in university, I gave a presentation in a university in France. A lot of people were asking me like, okay, how can I learn Ukrainian, right? Like because now it's way more important, and it's gonna be important in the future. I mean, like if you want to work in public affairs, if you want to work like in research, it's gonna be important. You will need to understand like what's happening here. There is a whole field which is developing, and I think that the all of this young generation of I wouldn't say of journalists because there are not that many, but just like of public affairs or just people in NGOs in France who already have this different vision. I also think that the vision changed. This kind of, let's say the good thing, and this is what some academics say, that the good thing that happened with the Ukrainian invasion is that there was no way to go back. To the vision that was before, like meaning that I think French people now understand that Ukraine is an independent country, that it's like that it's not Russia, and there is no way back. This is new reality. The readers understood it, and the experts understood it. So I think that now just there will be a different way to produce knowledge, to produce research, etc.
Smallly, I can add also as a researcher that previously to this full-scale invasion, they used to have only one institution, INALCO, Institute of Oriental Languages where you could study something about Ukrainian language or Ukrainian history or Ukrainian literature. Now we have, even in the institution where I work at Kyiv Media Academy, we already have partnerships with different institutions, even in Paris, Paris 8, and in many institutions, to have courses about Ukrainian history, about Ukrainian language. So it's a kind of, we already met a lot of young people, a lot of young French people talking perfect Ukrainian. So many years ago, they all spoke Russian, but now when they arrive, they say, I'm so ashamed I know Russian, I'll better study Ukrainian. And we already have people who studied there. For example, my colleague, he's French, his name is Alexis Sodone. He started his Ukrainian back in 2018 in Inalco, and now he lives in Lviv, and he speaks fluent Ukrainian without no accent at all. So, and there is a kind of fashionable thing to learn Ukrainian, to know something about Ukraine, and it's changing. So I think that for sure it's a major switch in institutions. And what Clara said, it's also important that people are chased from Russia. It's not only the case of researchers, it's also the case of journalists. I'm sorry, but Paul Gauguin and Benoît Wittkin, Benoît Wittkin is one of the major journalists from Le Monde, the most important newspaper, they left Russia because it's simply impossible to live here, because you are always followed, because you are persecuted, because there are real risks for your life, for your personal life. They have families. So people, they leave Russia because it's unvivable.
And this is going to create another problem, is that now we lack of real expertise on Russia. Like, people don't know what's going on there. And recently, like, it was just really funny when Prigozhin was tried to do his coup, and some journalists from Kyiv were called to comment on this. So it was a bit like, the reverse. Before, correspondents in Moscow would be called to give a comment on what's going on in Ukraine, and now it's the opposite. So, but I mean, like, in terms of translation as well, it's quite interesting what's happening, because we started to see that, for example, in terms of literature, a lot of translation started. Like, there is a new generation of translator, and it's, well, what's really interesting is that sometimes it kind of depends on like one or two people. Like, I'm thinking about one translator.
Let's not forget the diplomatic efforts of Ukrainian state, because Ukrainian Institute, they created this filiale in Paris, and it's a small team, but they do a lot. They do exhibitions, they do, I don't know, meetings with Ukrainian artists, with Ukrainian writers. All of this is important. So
there are so many artists, so many like Ukrainian artists coming to Paris. It's like, it's incredible. You have like concerts of Oke and Elzi and like Dacha Bracha, and I want to see Onuka recently. Like, there are just so many. Like, there have never been so many Ukrainian artists in France, and I think that it's quite. I mean, like, you can say, French people didn't know what was Ukraine, etc. But I mean, like, just this didn't exist. There was no translation of Ukrainian authors. These people were not like invited to perform. Like, I mean, it's also like, like this was just not accessible. And now there is way more interest, and even in the translation, like, those books actually are quite read. So.
Yeah, and the second, and in terms of Russian expertise, I think you can reach out to Ukrainians, because we know Russia very well. So the second question, make long story short, about the NATO. So France and Germany, two big power in Europe, and French fortunately supports Ukrainian membership to NATO, and Germany does not. Why do you think?
I'm not an expert.
Well, let's go back to history and back to 2008, and let us say that at that very moment, Ukraine had a chance to become a member, but France was against. United States were for with Bush, and France and Germany, because we lost this chance. But now, why Germany? We are not experts in Germany. We are very happy that France supports our NATO membership, but the problem is not Germany, but maybe United States at the moment. So my idea is that, my guess is that if American administration changes its mind, Germany will follow.
Yeah.
So it is the key
And
to
this is the echoes we have as well here, and yeah.
Any other questions?
Anyone? Questions?
Good evening. So you spoke about the support Ukraine had in the beginning of the war. And now the question could be, since the beginning of the war between Israel and Gaza, people from Palestine got a huge global support that didn't happen actually for Ukraine in same scale. So would you explain, do you have an idea of why there's that support actually for people from Palestine was so different actually from people from like Western countries, and that much for Ukraine now?
I mean, like, just when we see like, there was much more support for Ukraine than there is for Gaza. Like, just even if in terms of public opinion, in terms of actual humanitarian aid, like military aid, like there was much more support for Ukraine, and there is still much more support for Ukraine than there is for people in Gaza. So I mean, like, and I think that this is the case as well because I mean, like, because it's not the same. Like the way that Ukraine was attacked also because of NATO, because Ukraine wanted to be part of NATO, because Ukraine wanted to be part of EU, and we are part of EU. Like the war in like the war is like between Israel and Palestine is a regional conflict. Like, I mean, like, it touches us, but we do not. It's not the same type of conflict. Like we are not like allies in the same type of way. And actually, Macron kind of criticized Israel as well. So I think that it's just like completely different, and I don't think that it's something that should be compared. But even in terms of coverage, like of news coverage, there was much more coverage on Ukraine than there is on Middle East right now, and that there was even like after 7th of October. So, but in general, I think that there tends to be there is a tendency right now in the recently in the cover, like in the international coverage of more coverage, but reactive, let's say, like faster. So yes, faster. Everything is faster. So you have more news, but in a very short period of time. And then the challenge is like, continuing the coverage, having the coverage before and having the coverage after.
I have a funny story, maybe not funny, but a story about this rivalry between Ukraine and Palestine, according to this for this French attention. So we organized a poetry reading at the French University in Paris. So we were preparing things to read this poetry in French and then in Ukrainian, and gathering students and organizing the whole stuff. And then the administration of the university told us that there are a lot of Palestinian students at this university, so be prepared for provocations. Why provocations? What did we do? So we are just reading poetry because they will be jealous of the attention. So they're not organizing their things. Each time we suggest them, said the staff members, to organize their readings, they don't do it, but they could create something against you. Fortunately, nothing bad happened, so there were no problem, but there were some rumors, some exchanges in the media, why Ukrainians organize poetry reading at our university and we don't. So do organize it. So that's it, as simple as
But
this.
again, it was false, like, so nothing happened. So.
Happily for us, yeah, and for everybody.
So if any other questions, I think we can finish on it. Thank you very much to everyone. Yeah, please follow our social media and website for next announcements of the next events. Have a safe evening. Thank you.